In this lesson, I'm going to talk about your business idea and, in particular, what might impact the feasibility of your cottage food business idea. So, to give a brief overview, I'm going to talk about why you might want to start a business and how that can impact the feasibility of it. I'm going to talk about possibly funding your business or the financial readiness. I'm going to talk about picking your products wisely and, in particular, talking about some of the big red flags that you might want to be aware of, pricing your products and what to think about regarding that, and finally, some early stage feedback opportunities for you to determine the feasibility of your products and your idea. So to start out with the primary motivations, there's 6 main types of entrepreneurs, and most people are a combination of these, but you can think about what is your primary motivation for starting your business. You might want to start a business to support your community or support a cause. This would be somebody who's a lot less driven by money and making money and more interested in supporting something else. You might just want to do something fun, have a fun side hobby, perhaps do something in retirement. You might want to start a food business from home, and this is in particular somebody who is less interested in what they sell and more interested in just running a food business, serving people, making food, being very passionate about food. This type of entrepreneur also might be a bit less concerned with making money. You also might want to supplement your existing income. This would be the type of entrepreneur that is more focused on making money. And this could be someone like a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad who wants to support their spouse's income, or if you're an individual, you might want to pick up this as a side hobby or side gig to support the other income that you have from a full-time job. You also might want to sell a specific product. Some people really want to make their special recipe or their grandma's or grandpa's special recipe, and they're getting into this industry specifically to sell one item or a set of items, and they already have in their mind fixed what they're going to sell. And then finally, some people get into it because they need to make some money and replace their job income, or perhaps they want to quit their job and be free from working in a corporate structure. So going over these, I actually ordered these in terms of risk. So the likelihood that there's the risk factors that might determine whether the business is going to work or not. The higher up the list you go, the less risky it is, because the people who are less motivated by money aren't going to be as at risk for a business failure. So somebody who's just wanting to support their community or do something fun, those are the types of people that will almost certainly be guaranteed of success, because they're not going to have to worry about pricing and competition and all that from their market. Number 3 and 4 are kind of going hand in hand, but one is more focused on working from home specifically. Maybe they're a stay-at-home mom, stay-at-home dad, or they want to support their elders and they need to stay home for those reasons. And they just want to run a food business and they're less inclined to make money. And the number 4 is just more inclined to help support their family's income. But both of those are more of a flexible kind of business where they don't care so much what they make. Number 5 cares very much what they make. They want to sell a specific item, and this can be a risk because the market might not demand what you want to sell. Even if family and friends tell you it's great, or even if you think it's the most amazing thing, there simply might not be demand in the market, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then finally, replacing your job income. I wanted to talk about this one in particular because a number of people want to start a business to make money, or they need money and they think that starting a business is a great opportunity to make money, and it can be. But I would say when it comes to financial readiness, replacing your income is a good long-term goal, but I like to think of these kinds of businesses as organic, slow growth businesses where you're building up an audience, you're building up a customer base, and you're establishing yourself in your community, and that is going to take some time to establish the trust of your community so that people buy from you consistently, and you're essentially learning how to create a system. And that can take some time. It can take even a few years to develop that system. Sometimes it happens within a year, but if you're needing to make money to pay your next paycheck or pay rent, it's probably not a great business to start right now. You might want to make sure that you don't have existing debts, or make sure that you have a good chunk of cash or capital to fall back on, or you might want to have a full-time job. I think of it as like raising a child, where, if you want the child to stand on its own two legs, you have to give it some time and you have to nurture it quite a bit before it'll be totally independent. And I like to think of cottage food businesses as test businesses. They certainly might become full-fledged business. Your idea might grow into the idea might grow into something that has its own legs and will carry itself forward independently. But I like to think of these businesses as test businesses, because that sort of helps me not try to make everything perfect, and it allows me to just learn from this business and know that I'm just kind of learning from the market and growing and changing and adapting over time. As I said, you should have some sort of capital or financial support. This could be somebody else's income, like a partner's income, or it could be some capital that you have to support the business if it doesn't work out. And finally, I wanted to say that there is not really intensive capital requirements. You could start a business for less than $100. So it's not like you need a lot of capital, but you just shouldn't be relying on that income to make ends meet. And then finally, if you really do need some financial support to get going, even $100 or $500 or $1,000, it is very difficult to get a traditional loan, like a bank loan or an SBA loan. If you're just starting out and you've never gotten a loan before, you really need to have some established history in your business to get that. So funding opportunities would be more like self-funding is the most common, where you're funding the business yourself, or you could reach out to family and friends, perhaps use a credit card, and again, using very small amount of credit card debt to get this business going, maybe spending $100 to make $500, and then using that $500 to make $1,000, etc., and kind of leapfrogging from there. You could get personal loans from friends that maybe have an interest rate and a handwritten note. Or crowdsourcing is another option, where you can use Kickstarter or some other crowdsourcing online campaigns. I put this as one of the last options because it's actually not that easy to get a Kickstarter campaign running and to get a significant amount of money from it these days. And then finally, there's also the option of getting a microloan from a nonprofit lender. This is also a bit more of a complex option, but a possible one if you don't have a lot of history with your business. I'm assuming that you're just getting started out with this venture. Okay, so picking your products wisely. People often have an idea for what they want to sell in advance, and you might know right now what you're going to sell, and there's nothing that'll change that in your mind, in which case you could probably skip this section. But this section is to just guide you in terms of thinking about what factors might be important in determining whether your products are going to be feasible for a business or not, and what products do better and what products do worse. And I do want to say that your business, no matter what you sell or no matter how you start it, it will surprise you. It will take surprising turns. And your adaptability and your flexibility as a business owner is key in listening to the market and determining what they want. So we're not going to be so fixed in terms of thinking about what we're going to sell. I found that business owners that are flexible tend to do better in terms of getting their business off the ground. And also, you can look at what is popular at local markets. You can go to farmers markets. And the reason why I put this in here is because sometimes people get caught up in thinking that if there's other people selling things at markets, then they shouldn't do that because it's already been taken. Whereas the reality is, if somebody is selling it, that means that there are customers demanding that product. If nobody is selling it, then that's not as good of a sign, because that might mean that there is no customer demand for a product. But we'll talk a little more about that. Okay, so the red flags for a product, there are a number of them. First of all, a generic product, something that you could find on a grocery store shelf, that is going to be a product that isn't going to command as much attention, perhaps. You want your products to be a bit more unique than something you could just find at a basic grocery store. And I should say that these red flags, and just having one or two of them isn't necessarily a big deal, but it's when you start adding up the red flags that it can become a problem. Short shelf life is another one. Some products have a short shelf life. They might only last or be fresh for a couple days, and that can be a big problem if you don't sell out your product at a market. A low perceived value, sometimes products just don't have a high perceived value because of whatever the value is at a grocery store or whatnot. So that is another major concern. And labor intensive, some products are very labor intensive. And I'll get into some examples here and go over these so you have some ideas for what I mean. But yeah, some products can take hours or days. And then expensive ingredients, some products just are handicapped by their ingredient expense themselves. The product that's going into it is just too expensive to make up for that in terms of sales price. And finally, if something is perceived as unhealthy, that can not do as well, just because the trend right now is towards more healthy and nutritious items. But again, just one of these things or two of these things isn't necessarily enough to cause too much concern. And then the final one that I'll talk about a little later is requires change in consumer behavior, and I'll save that one for the last. Examples, chocolate chip cookies. That's my favorite example because that's what I initially got into when I was starting my business. I wanted to sell chocolate chip cookies, but these have a number of red flags. First of all, they're a generic product. Even if you're like me and you think that you have the best chocolate chip cookies in the world and people tell you that, it is still a generic product. It is something that a lot of people make and are used to, and it's not a special item. There's nothing that unique about it. Short shelf life for sure. My cookies last maybe a couple days or a few days at the most. You could refrigerate them or freeze them, but generally speaking, they have a very short shelf life while they're fresh, and that can be really problematic. They have a very low perceived value. Cookies in general, drop cookies, basic cookies. You get 3 dozen at the grocery store for $5, which of course these are factory produced cookies and they don't taste great and they're not as good as homemade. But that perceived value will translate into the market, because if you're trying to charge a fair price for your cookies at a market, say, $10 for a dozen or something like that, that's going to seem very expensive to a prospective buyer. Cookies are also fairly labor intensive. They can take quite a bit of time between mixing the dough and having to put them on the cookie sheets and separate them out in individual cookies. They're a bit more labor intensive than most, and they're definitely perceived as being an unhealthy item. So you add all these red flags up, and chocolate chip cookies don't typically make for a very good cottage food business. At least that's what I've found, and I haven't really seen any chocolate chip cookie businesses that have taken off and done really well. This also applies to a lot of these pre-mixed box mixed items like brownies. Selling brownies is going to be a generic product. You're going to have a short shelf life, low perceived value, perceived as unhealthy. And I see brownies like this sold at farmers markets, but I kind of question if people are actually making any money from them. It's fine to sell them if it's just a hobby or if you're just supporting your community, but to actually do this as a sustainable and viable business, probably not. You're probably going to have to change it. And this also applies to generic muffins, coffee cake rolls, Rice Krispie treats, etc., etc. These are all items that aren't going to command a very high price at a market typically. Jams and jellies are another one that seems like a good idea, but if you look at it, it's a generic product. You can get a grape jelly at the grocery store for a couple bucks or $3, and that is easy to buy from a grocery store. Um, Very, very labor intensive. Typically, it can take hours to process jams and jellies, and the ingredients are expensive, especially things like raspberry jam. They're going to be prohibitively expensive in terms of their ingredients, but if you're growing these ingredients yourself, then you can potentially do better because you're not having to buy those or source those from uh, a producer. And then they are perceived as unhealthy, maybe less so. These do a little bit better at a farmer's market where people are looking for produce, but because of the added sugar, they're definitely usually perceived as unhealthy. So those are some big examples of things that have a lot of red flags. Something that is a little bit more balanced, that has just a few, would be like dried pasta noodles. These are going to have a low perceived value. If you go to a generic brand, get a generic brand in a grocery store, it's going to be like $1 per pound, at least in my area, for getting dry pasta noodles. So that's going to really limit the amount of price that you can command. And then they are very labor intensive, with having to mix the dough and roll it out multiple times, and then you cut it and then have to let it dry. These two factors alone could potentially mean that it's not going to be a good business for you. But I have seen some pasta noodle companies, and it's not necessarily a horrible idea, but it's just things to think about that might not allow you to do as well with this business. And then fruit pies is a good example that has some red flags, but still can be quite a viable business. It's a fairly generic product that you can pick up at a store, like a strawberry or cherry pie. It has a short shelf life, but you can overcome that by freezing pies generally, so that can help a lot. Um, they can be perceived as unhealthy. It's kind of like the jams and jellies, where they have a lot of fruits in them, and so that can kind of offset the perception. But most people think of it as a dessert and as being an unhealthy item. But they have a high perceived value. Sometimes I've seen pies selling for $20, even $30 each, sometimes, depending on the pie. And, maybe closer to $12 to $15. But that higher price can completely offset these problems. And I've seen many pie businesses flourish under the Cottage food law. So that just is a good example of not to take these red flags too seriously, just to think about them. And they're not as labor intensive because you're making an entire pie at once. So that is helpful as well. Um, this last one I mentioned earlier requires change in consumer behavior, and this is kind of a unique one. But basically, when a lot of people start their business because they don't see anybody else doing something, they think they have this amazing, new, unique idea. Typically, this is an invention. You might run it by somebody else, and they say, "Oh, that's a great idea." That this kind of idea that maybe nobody is familiar with is one that the market is less likely to notice it because they're not familiar with it. And it might require a change of consumer behavior. You might need to educate your customers about the product. And I see a lot of these ideas, and I see businesses struggle because you are having to change the way that people operate. And I'll go through some examples of these so you can get an idea. There's 3 companies that I picked out. These are all businesses that have closed. And I picked these businesses in particular because they all persisted with their idea, and they all did a really good job of branding. In other words, I don't see any problem with these ideas except for just the business idea themselves. So let's start with the first one, Mallow and Hop. I'm really impressed with this entrepreneur. She started this business selling custom or flavored marshmallows. And on the surface, it sounds like a pretty good idea because it's like unique and new and novel. And but you're not used to buying custom marshmallows. Typically, just buy the white ones at the grocery store. And so this is her packaging. It's nice packaging, nice logo labeling. This is the mocha swirl flavor, and she would have to educate her customers though at the market and how they would actually use these or consume these. Most people are used to using marshmallows in Rice Krispie treats or in s'mores, or perhaps putting them in their drinks. But she was, you know, trying to tell people that they could just eat these as candy, and that wasn't necessarily a bad idea, but it's just not something that consumers were used to. So here she's dipping her product in chocolate to try to show people how they can eat it straight, or she had a number of other ideas that people could use their marshmallows for. And her stand, as you can see, she did a very nice job. She put quite a bit of time and effort and money into marketing herself, creating nice business cards, creating a nice logo, creating a nice display, nice packaging. Um, up in the top right here, she also started to chocolate dip her marshmallows to have it be more like a candy bar. And then she also, I think, ventured into some baked goods to diversify her product line. But ultimately, she tried this for a few years, and ultimately, it just was too hard to get people to buy her product time and time again. Didn't help that her product was perceived as unhealthy. And ultimately, I think it was just the fact that it required people to change their behavior, and they didn't really know what to do with the marshmallows. The next example, right on Biscotti. This person is actually very close to me. She started this business a couple of years ago, and she the concept is selling something that's very standard, biscotti cookies that you would dip into a hot drink. But the unique side of her business was to try to sell these cookies with phrases or messages on it. This is the kind of idea I think you'd run by somebody and they go, "Oh, that's a good idea." Um, but the reality is that people aren't used to buying biscotti in this form, and they're not used to, if they want to send a message to someone, they'd likely send it in a card. They probably wouldn't send it in a platter of biscotti cookies. So I think this one, I mean, she did a really, and you can see the photography is great. She did a nice job with her logo. She probably paid a designer quite a bit to create that for her. And ultimately, I think that the problem here is just that she had to convince people that they would even want to buy a product like this. And it probably required quite a bit of marketing effort. And ultimately, she finally closed her doors after some effort. And then the final one, Florida Natural Delights. This entrepreneur, she started and ran her business for a few years and gave it a really good effort. She was selling energy spreads. I think that's what she called them. They're basically kind of like nut butters mixed with jams or jellies, and I think some other ingredients. So she was trying to sell a kind of a newer novel product and have people put these energy spreads for a boost of energy on a piece of bread or something. And now this isn't that unique of a concept because people are already used to putting like jams and jellies um, on bread and on things like English muffins. But even still, if you went to her booth, you didn't necessarily know what you were looking at. It wasn't something that was something that you'd maybe be used to consuming, and I think that kind of hampered her from being able to take this business well off the ground, because she did give it a good solid effort. You can see her design and her logo and her business cards are all excellent. Her labels. So she didn't really do anything wrong. She did a lot of social media marketing, but ultimately I just think it wasn't something that customers were used to buying. And she had a hard time selling this product and making a sustainable business. So that's just what I mean with changing consumer behavior. Um, Sometimes a new idea isn't necessarily going to work really well. So that's some of the red flags. Let's talk about some of the good things that you can uh, help determine whether there's some good signs that your product will work well. A unique twist on an item, and this is kind of funny because I just talked about how products don't do as well if they're unique. But I don't mean like where it's completely changing consumer behavior. I mean where you just kind of have a twist on something where something's a little bit new or novel, especially with unique flavors of items where people go, oh, I haven't tried that before. Oh, I haven't seen that before. Sometimes unique items work super well. Sometimes just even changing the packaging can be a way of providing a unique twist on an item. Perceived to be healthier is certainly a huge trend right now. Anything that has a perception of being healthy, even if it's not healthy, if it has a perception of being healthy, that is going to likely drive up the price. Something diet specific or trendy, things like keto, vegan, gluten-free, peanut-free, any of these things that maybe cater to allergy needs, or diet wants. Any of those things can dramatically increase the price, especially in certain areas of the country. And anything creative or artistic, custom made, where you're adding your own creative elements to it, custom decorated cookies. We talked about how chocolate chip cookies weren't great. Custom decorated cookies, on the other hand, can be really good because they have that creative touch. The custom cakes is certainly a huge one for this industry that does very well. So anything that has that kind of creative or artistic touch is going to be much more likely to do well because you can value products a lot higher. And then giftable is another thing where just making something into a gift can really make it a lot perceived, have a much higher perceived value. Anything that they can buy and then give to somebody else, people are willing to spend more on that typically. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about pricing. You really want to focus on perceived value. We just talked about that with your product selection, but it's the perception that matters. Certain things will have a perceived value and certain things will have a low perceived value, and it's not necessarily connected to how much effort it takes for you to make it. It's not necessarily connected to how much the ingredients cost. It's just based on what the customer values at the time that they're buying it. And that's ultimately the most important factor. And you can partially create that value, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I also wanted to say, don't worry about your pricing too much. People get really caught up in the pricing and, oh, am I pricing too high? Am I pricing too low? And they get all the calculations and the spreadsheets and everything. When we're starting this business, and again, I'm assuming that you're just starting out and you're trying to get off the ground, the biggest risk to your business is understanding whether there's any demand in your market, whether people actually want to buy your product. And one problem is if you price too high and your product doesn't sell, then you won't know if it was priced incorrectly or if there simply wasn't demand. And so I typically recommend starting at a lower price when you're just getting started out, establishing that trust, and then increasing your pricing over time so that if your product doesn't sell, then you know that it's a problem with the product and not a problem with the price. This might not be sustainable at first because you might not be making any money, you might not be compensating for your time. Um, and that I think is okay because it's kind of like a test business where we're learning, we're growing, we're adapting, and we can change our prices over time. We can raise our prices over time. That is something people worry about. They're afraid of increasing their pricing, or they're uncomfortable doing that. Typically, it's very easy to do, and if you are undercharging for your products when you increase your price, you probably won't get pushback. You'll probably get customers saying it's about time that you increased your prices. So don't worry about pricing too much because it is a flexible thing, and you're just trying to gauge the interest in the market. Finally, we're going to talk about the 3 C's of pricing: calculating, comparing, and creating. Starting with calculating, this is one of the most typical ways of pricing a product, but it can get you stuck. So we're going to start by the COGS, that would be the cost of goods sold, and that is a base price. I would definitely recommend calculating your ingredients or any variable costs. That would be kind of the bare minimum price in my mind, because you want to make sure you're at least covering ingredient costs. But ingredient costs that you might be paying today might be higher because you might be going to a grocery store. Those might be higher than what you'll be paying in the future because as you scale, you might be getting wholesale accounts and being able to reduce the ingredient cost. And don't include your time in the calculation. People like to value their time at a certain rate, and I'm sure most business coaches just shuddered when I said this, but I don't like to factor in my time when I'm considering a base price, just because you can get yourself stuck. You can get yourself into a place where you're creating a price that just is unreasonable for the market. So I like to give my time away at first as I'm trying to get a business off the ground. And again, this is a starting point. It's a bare minimum price. I would not go lower than this price, because if you can't even get this price for your product, then I don't see any way that you're going to be able to improve it over time to the point where you can make some money with this. And we'll talk about a little bit about improving. Comparing. If you're going to compare product prices, compare at the right places. So farmers markets, bakeries, specialty food stores, Whole Foods, all these places are going to have prices that are a bit more indicative of your target market. Don't compare to grocery store prices, discount grocery store prices, anything that's factory produced, that's not handmade. You're just not going to be able to compete with that kind of pricing. So, you always have to be a little wary with comparing when you're pricing, but if you are going to compare, make sure you do it at a place that's charging reasonable prices for their products. And then finally, creation. You can adjust the amount that you can charge by adding value to your offer. This starts with you, your story, and the connection that you have with your customer, your communication. All of these things can definitely impact your ability to charge, and you can charge a lot more if people connect to you and feel like they're part of your journey. Customization also is a big one, where you can charge a lot more if you customize your items in any way, as we talked about earlier. Gift-worthy packaging, or any of those positive signs we talked about earlier, are ways that you can increase the price or add value to your offer. And then free delivery is another one that I typically like to do at the very beginning of a business, to just add that extra value and make sure there's no barriers to entry for somebody to buy my product. And then also, you can always add things in the future. Don't get too caught up in trying to add everything and make the perfect offer. You can add these elements over time, but it's just, I mentioned them to let you know that even if you're not running a sustainable business with pricing up front at the beginning, you can do a lot better over time by adding a lot of marketing touches to your offer. And then finally, let's talk a little bit about early stage feedback. One way you can do this, and this is before validation, you can offer free samples to your community. And I would think in terms of the people you already interact with, work coworkers, neighbors, people you might see at the gym, church members, or organizations you're a part of. Any of these places are a good place to start to interact with people, engage with people, and offer them free samples and get their feedback. But when you get their feedback, make sure to ask them about a specific price. Don't just ask them, would you buy this, or is it good? Because everyone's going to say it's good, or everyone's going to say that they're willing to buy it. You should have them envision themselves at a market and say, like, oh, you don't know me, and pretend you don't know me. Try this. And would you be willing to pay $7.50 for this? If you're at a market right now, would you buy it? And that is a much better way of gauging interest. And we're going to talk a lot more about gauging interest in the validation section that's coming up in the future lessons. But this is just kind of to get early stage basic feedback. And then also find local food business owners. Go to farmers markets, go to events, go to bakeries, shops, and ask for their advice and help. They will be able to give you a wealth of information. Maybe some people won't be willing, or they'll be too busy, but you will likely find people who are more than happy to help you. and will allow you to navigate some of the things that might be characteristic of your local market in particular. So definitely go out to markets and talk to the vendors and the people who are already running these businesses, the people who have gone before you. That is a great way to get feedback about your business idea. And then finally, the market ultimately tests the pricing for any given offer. You can always change the offer, improve the offer, but ultimately it's the customer that determines whether your pricing is accurate. And this involves testing, 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 and you might have to test a few different prices or a few different offers before you find what works. Um, and, and along those lines, we're going to be talking about validation in the upcoming lessons. And in my mind, you only validate through actually selling your product, actually charging people for it, actually getting people to pull out their wallets, and especially recurring sales. When somebody comes back and buys your product again, that's when you truly know that you've validated your product. And remember that you need very little to start talking to people and selling your products. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the validation lesson, but you don't need to do too much right now to get started selling. And we're going to jump right into selling in the next lesson. So just be mindful that it's not like you have to do this wealth of things. I talked about the pricing and the product selection and some of the key things that you might think about when you're considering the feasibility of your product. But don't get too caught up in it. Ultimately, it just comes down to testing your product in the market and validating with real paying customers. And we'll get to that in the next lesson.